All right, hello everybody. Kind of a little short on video making time right now. I'm trying to finish up the last couple of editing steps on my novel, but I just finished. I'm still trying to read some stuff in the meantime, and I actually just finished reading for the first time. Actually, reading Isaac Asimov's Foundation. So I figured I would talk about it a little bit. So, just as a quick intro, my personal history is that back in the day in high school when I did a lot of reading, not necessarily of science fiction, but just a lot of reading in general, I read one or two of Isaac Asimov's robot books and, enjoyed them. Um, and I, of course, heard about the Foundation series, but I never actually managed to get my hands on a copy of it. Um, it's one of those things where whenever I looked for it, it seemed like it wasn't available. So I wouldn't look for it like intensely, right? It'd be like, oh, Foundation. I wonder if a copy of that's available. And whenever I had the the wherewithal to say, oh, I wonder if a copy of Foundation is around here somewhere, whether it be a library or a bookstore or whatever, it would just so happen that those times it wouldn't be available, and then it would go off back to the back of my mind, and I would forget about it. I actually ended up getting interested in some of Asimov's nonfiction. I read his book on photosynthesis, and I think one of his science history books, although I can't remember which one. This was 10th grade. Anyway, Foundation is a interesting book. It's not what I thought it was going to be in a few ways, and we'll get to that. Publication history. The first Foundation book was written between 1942 and 1944, and it was actually published as a series of, I believe, four novellas and one probably that's too short to call a novella, more of a novelette or something like that, published in Astounding Stories, which, not ironically, is the same place that some of that early Lensman stuff was published, and kind of in the same era, actually. We're talking, early 1940s. But whereas the Lensman series is kind of swashbuckling and has a very practical and clear sense of right and wrong, it's a crime fighting story at its base. Foundation is more cerebral, more about people making detailed plans, and less focused on right versus wrong, based versus this is just how people kind of are, whether it be good for some and bad for others. To give kind of a plot summary, Foundation, the first Foundation book, which is all I've read so far. I've read the first couple of pages of Foundation and Empire, but the story is split up into 5 different stories, which were the novellas and one novelette or short story that ended up in Astounding Stories, at the founding of the Foundation, out to about 155 years after the founding of the Foundation. So the character of Harry Seldon is kind of the glue that sticks everything together, because he's what is referred to in the book as a psychohistorian, psycho. I am blanking on the exact technical term they use, but it's basically an application of psychology to large groups of people who are unaware of the ability to predict the movements of large groups of people through psychohistory. So, we start out with the founding. Harry Seldon founds the Foundation, and basically the other parts of the story happen much later. Part 2 happens 50 years later. Part 3 happens a total of 80 years after the founding. Part 4 is kind of at some indeterminate point in between 80 and 155 years, and then Part 5 is 155 years. And what we see is this Foundation kind of moving from what started out as a scientific and cultural endeavor into something that is, actually like a force for technological advancement under the guise, technological advancement privately, and then technological distribution under the guise of kind of a weird pseudo-religion kind of thing, onto a kind of a trade-based organization that sells their own particular high tech to various places throughout the periphery. At the time of the founding, there is this massive galaxy-spanning empire, and everything to an unilluminated observer, it looks like everything's going fine, but this Harry Seldon guy basically predicts that everything's kind of going to go to crap in this empire, and mankind is risking a 30,000 year period of like a dark age, and he's like, well, if I do things right, I can maybe get it down to 1,000. And this story is about what happens in the preceding 155 years, or in the proceeding 155 years, as the Foundation kind of gets its start. So, originally he kind of sells this to the Emperor as like, well, we're going to make an encyclopedia, and that way, when things go bad, we can distribute this encyclopedia, and everybody will know, oh, there's these cultural artifacts, there's these scientific discoveries, and that way we won't lose too much when things kind of go bad. And so they get set up at the far end of the galaxy, and of course, it's interesting because Harry Seldon is a predictor but not a planner, if that makes sense. There were a lot of cool ideas in this book. I found it really interesting and thought-inspiring in a variety of ways. But like, Harry Seldon has predicted how things are going to go based on kind of these large general swaths of human activity. And he has created the Foundation with a specific set of incentives that cause it to do the things that are required to help mankind maintain or fight off the Dark Age faster, without actually having any like hands-on ability to deal with it. Harry Seldon, dies within a year after the founding or something like that, is what we're told. He's like, yeah, I have cancer or whatever at the end of the first part. And then we jump to 50 years later, where basically there's a Seldon crisis, and he appears in holograph form in this one particular room at the Foundation, and doesn't really tell them what to do. He's just like, yep, things are going to go bad, and you're going to only have one path to move forward, and so you got to take that path. It's very weird, because from what I had heard about Foundation, I was worried it was going to be kind of one of those like super structured, like central planning kind of stories, where like great men, by their power over humanity, push humanity to greater heights. And it's not actually that kind of book. It's very much more like a human story, to the point where it's funny, but like most of the science fiction in this science fiction, and like it won best. In 1966, the Hugo Awards had like a one-time thing where, what's the best science fiction series of all time, right? And it was, the final two, or at least, the one that won was Foundation, the original Foundation trilogy, 3 books. And one of the things it won out over was Lensman series, actually. So, but it's funny because, whereas when I was talking about Lensman, I'm like, oh, Smith has this fun idea of like, let's just make relativity not be a thing, and let's just equalize classical drag forces with thrust. Well, that's a cool like engineering idea, but it feels sciencey, right? We talk about, I talked about various elements of Lensman where, obviously it's highly fictionalized, but there's at least some kind of like, oh, there's some scientific thing here. Oh, there's some, right? As for Foundation, it's funny because most of the science stuff is pretty like optional. Like, I was reading about it, and apparently Asimov wrote it as kind of like an allegory for the fall of Rome. And it's like, well, you could actually kind of do that if you wanted to, and just have like the one of the last Roman emperors, right, create a foundation somewhere in the world that maintains some of Rome's knowledge, and then continues to innovate in like small scale stuff. And you could tell that story where, like, instead of like these tiny atomic engines they have, they're just like alkaline batteries or something like that. You could literally kind of do that, which I think is really funny, because nowadays the definition of science fiction that you see for like the magazines, right? That publish science fiction are like, well, the science has to be an integral part of the story. If you take out the science fiction element, then the story has to collapse. And you can almost do that with Foundation. And so it's like I kind of had this weird thought, like, man, if someone wrote Foundation today, right, and they handed it over to Analog or whatever, would they even be like, this isn't science fiction? This is just a historical allegory with science fiction elements, with futurist elements that aren't really integral to the story. It just kind of was a funny thought that I had about it, about how we've gotten so picky about science fiction these days in certain ways. Certain people have, at least. But yeah, what ends up happening is that it's not really like a grand scale planning story, which is what I was worried it was going to be. I was worried it was going to be kind of like a Star Trek Federation kind of thing. But it's actually very different because, first off, the stories that we get are really pretty like close-in human stories for the most part. We have a main character or a couple of main characters per part, and for the most part, they don't really appear between different parts because they're separated by so many years. There's one exception, which is Salvor Hardin, who appears briefly in part 2, but then is the focus of part 3. He's an interesting character, and there's not like some group of masterminds that are like planning out the path of mankind. Although what I will say is that there are some very fun little schemes that get hatched that save the Foundation at the last moment, kind of thing. I won't spoil those, but they're extremely satisfying and fun to read. The most powerful, the most gripping moments of the book. Scenes in the book involve one character kind of out planning another in a very interesting way. And, there's without spoiling too much, in part 3, there's a scene where Salvor Hardin is like sitting somewhere, smoking a cigar and drinking tea. And someone's like, yeah, you're a prisoner of war. He's like, am I? It's really, really fun, really little fun moments there where someone who is believed to be kind of on the ropes suddenly turns it around. A very fun little situation there. All in all, the book is actually pretty funny. Like, there's a lot of moments that are kind of humorous, a lot of moments that are satirical. There's this great moment where an Empire diplomat shows up in part 2, and Asimov describes him as leaving out all the R's when he speaks. And actually writes him that way. And so you get this very, very like highfalutin impression of this character. And at the same time where things are still funny in ways, and some things are humorous, and there's like a light amount of satire here and there, there's actually some really good, like, incisive thoughts there. Like, this diplomat is talking about the scientific method. He's like, well, I've read all of the authoritative works, and I've compared them, and I've come to my conclusions, and that's the scientific method, right? And the other character's like, no wonder civilization is collapsing if this is what someone thinks the scientific method is. There was no experiment, no hands-on understanding, no boots on the ground, no measurement anywhere in his scientific process. There's this great part where like a treaty and the statements of a politician are taken, and a guy hands them to formal logicians, and is like, what's actually said in this treaty? What's actually said by this politician here? And their answer is nothing. There's some good, like, really solid, like, commentary in there that's not too, like, it doesn't bash you over the head too much. It's actually very relatable, I think. There's some, I think it was parts 3 and 4, where like the dialogue gets very Doc Smithy for a little while. Like part 1 and part 2 don't have a lot of like slang, like fake made up like space slang. But then like part of part 3 and I think part 4 have a bunch of like space slang in there, and so I wonder if Asimov was reading Smith at the time, and like, or similar authors, and took kind of that kind of tone of dialogue from them for a bit. It's interesting because like I was worried that this is going to be, very contrived, right? But in fact, it's not contrived at all. the people who are not acting, generally speaking, on orders from Harry Seldon, or there's no like general mastermind that's running everything. There's some intelligent people who come up with some good plans here and there, but in general, right, like the plans that are hatched, excuse me, in part 3 get overturned in part 4, and so on and so forth. And of course, they're separated by X number of decades, and so they're not like super like relevant. And there's no like there's a lot of science fiction stories that talk about these kind of vast empire spanning empires. I mean, galaxy spanning empires, right? Where you feel like, oh, everything that's happening is based on this one guy or this one group or this one council that kind of is puppeteering and pulling all the strings everywhere. And we get quite the opposite of that in this, where like Harry Seldon shows up as a hologram. He's like, "Yep, good luck, guys." It's like we were expecting guidance, and the guidance we got was that I'm pretty sure that if I set things up right, that there will be only one meaningful course of action for you whenever one of these crises happens. And they're like, "Well, gee, thanks." It's almost like self-fulfilling in like a fortune teller sense, right? It's like, yeah, I totally predicted all this, guys. Get to work. And it's like, what do we do? Get to work. like you don't feel like Seldon is pulling the strings. You feel like maybe he was visionary in the sense that he was like, well, if I set up these particular incentives for the Foundation, it'll end up working out this way in the long term. And maybe that's what happened, right? But so far in the first book alone, we don't get a lot of like confirmation that he necessarily did anything but kind of put the first step in motion, and he had no real influence on the rest of it, other than that people believe him to be kind of like a prophet in some respects. Yeah, it's a great counterpoint for the Lensman series, where the Lensman series is very actiony, right? And this is very much more dialogue focused, and there's a lot of talk about like new weapons and fast moving ships and force fields and ray beams and spy rays and mind powers and telekinesis in Lensman, whereas so this is just kind of like regular people, and there's a little bit of the high tech stuff in the background, but really it doesn't make that much of a difference, honestly. We get no details about how travel is done or how communication is done. And to a certain degree, it feels like if the Galactic Empire existed at some point and was able to maintain communications with the periphery, that there would be some kind of like better safeguards against them kind of falling off and becoming their own independent kingdoms or whatever. But like the story is pretty fun regardless. Let's see, anything else I wanted to say? The one thing I wanted to say that I thought was interesting was actually one of the cool ideas that I thought was kind of fun, where what ends up happening is that there's a collapse of understanding inside the Empire. And so the Empire has built all of these really large, like because they're so materially rich, they built all of these really large, say, atomic reactors, right, to produce energy for cities. And they're these giant buildings that are 10 stories tall and, have been running for, 1,000 years kind of thing, 2,000 years, and are expected to continue running for another 1,000 years. And the basic idea is that by setting up the Foundation in an area where there's very little material wealth, that the Foundation was instead forced to focus on miniaturizing a lot of the technology that the Empire had in its heyday. And so we get this cool kind of like from an economic perspective, it's interesting. It's like the conflict between macro versus micro, if that makes sense. We get some cool ideas about like how economic warfare would work in this kind of situation, and like controlling or at least preventing violence by restricting access to various technologies, which in the book is said, oh yeah, this was a war, but it was the least warlike war that anyone ever fought, because no one ever because basically nobody got killed, because it was all done by, oh, you don't want, don't you want good, don't you want dishwashers, kind of thing. It's a little far-fetched, but it works pretty well in the story. And it's worth noting that at least, from the perspective of what was about to happen, that this economic warfare is much less violent than the alternative. So I can kind of forgive it a little bit for kind of displaying a little bit of a shrouded ideal there, if that makes sense. Yeah, all in all, I think I really enjoyed it. It's a very different animal from, say, Lensman series, and it's a different animal from what I thought it was gonna be. And so you might find the same, because Asimov always struck me as kind of a dry writer. Like, maybe it was because I was reading a bunch of his nonfiction, right? But like the first robot book, I don't remember like seeing like there was a lot of humor in it, but there's actually a decent amount of humor in Foundation, and I found myself chuckling quite a bit as I went through and saw people's reactions or opinions of various other people's ideas and stuff like that. And then the thing about the guy who just reads books and calls that the scientific method, I found that very interesting as well. Something to remind ourselves that that theory is nothing without experiment. So, yeah. I also just as a totally side issue, I thought it was kind of fun that I was reading Foundation on the Internet Archive. It's kind of like, this is I'm reading about this group of scientists that have been tasked with maintaining records of culture and science and stuff like that, on a website dedicated to maintaining records of culture and science and stuff like that. Say what you like about the leadership of the Internet Archive. They at least do that particular job reasonably well in certain cases. But yeah, I'll probably be. I'm gonna go back to, because I have to do Gray Lensman. Gray Lensman is gonna be next. But I'll probably go back to Foundation and Empire at some point, because I really enjoyed Asimov's style in the book, honestly. And I kind of want to see what happens next. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I probably going to be a little short on videos this week and maybe the next week too, because I'm trying to finish up that novel. And go through the last couple of stages of editing. I'm getting to the point where I change one or two sentences per chapter, which is it's solidifying pretty well. So hopefully we'll have something on that soon. But as for now, I'm going to get back to that, and I'm going to go read Gray Lensman maybe this weekend, and I'll get you guys something about that soon. Very fun to see the contrast between the two. I feel like this was a good time to. I feel like it was because I had not heard about Lensman when I was in high school, and so if I had read Foundation then, I would not have read Foundation alongside Lensman, and I feel like my perspective, or at least my ability to perceive things, is better with both of them being fresher in my mind. So hopefully that's useful for you guys too. So I will call it here. As always, thanks for watching. Thank you for listening. If you want to support the channel, you know what to do. And I will see you next time with whatever it is that I happen to come up with for the next video. But yeah, Foundation. Very fun book. Not what I expected. May not be what you expected. Worth a look if you can, if you feel like getting your hands on a copy, even via the Internet Archive. Anyway, have a good one, and I'll see you later.